Thanks for joining us today. I will be talking about Hanami 2.0. First, a quick introduction. My name is Piotr Solnica. I'm a software engineer from Poland. I am currently in Krakow, and I recently joined a company called Valued. We are building a product analytics system in Elixir and Ruby at the same time, which is a lot of fun. I've been working on open source for quite a while. For many years, I've been focusing on projects like DryRB, RomRB, and of course, Hanami. I have a website at solnica.codes where sometimes I write some blog posts. So before I start talking about Hanami, I just want to quickly mention something that I'm really excited about because Victor recently added support for immutable data types to Ruby. And I'm just super excited about this. And I think Victor is here. So hello and thank you, because this is really big news for us because actually Hanami promotes a very specific style of programming, which is more functional. And this feature specifically will be very useful. So I'm very grateful for this and very happy to see it. So I cannot wait to use it. So yeah. Let's jump into Hanami 2.0. So this is kind of funny because last year I was talking about Hanami 2.0 as well. And I thought we're going to have it released last year. But yeah, things happened and it didn't work the way we planned. But actually, it's going to happen now. We are wrapping up very basic remaining tasks. There's a pretty clear road towards the final release. We are wrapping up beta releases as we speak. And soon we will release the first release candidate. And we'll probably have a couple of release candidates, and then the final version will be released hopefully in November. So yeah, I will quickly go through main ideas behind Hanami as a project, and then show you a little bit of what's coming in the 2.0 release. So Hanami is a full stack application framework, and one thing to notice is that this is a application framework, not necessarily a web application framework. What this means is that you can use Hanami to build any kind of a application in Ruby. But of course, web applications are very, very common. So probably people will use Hanami mostly for web applications, and it'll obviously have a lot of features related to web development. So it's got modular design right from the start. This is really big part of the framework because a lot of effort has gone into this particular aspect of the system, so that it has a very small core functionality, and pretty much everything is plugged into it as an external module that was just integrated using public APIs. This makes Hanami very extendable and just easy to use in various scenarios, regardless of what your application is doing, because you can just plug a lot of stuff in with ease. We also follow convention over configuration, which I believe is kind of a standard in Ruby. Rails made it a very popular thing to follow, and it's almost like an expectation to have a library or a framework which just works out of the box, and you don't have to deal with configuration too much. And last thing is that we want the framework to be lightweight by default. Like I mentioned, it's got a very small core, almost like an empty shell, and the default functionality should also be very lightweight and consume consume as little memory as possible and be fast. Now, quick mention about Hanami 2.1 before I dive into 2.0. This is something we decided recently, that Hanami 2.0 will not include the view layer and related functionality, just because we wanted to ship 2.0 sooner This means that the full stack framework, as in the web framework, will be released as 2.1, and this release will include the view layer, the assets and helpers related to the views, and probably a couple of other things. But for now, we are releasing a version that will be covering like basic web functionality. So great option for building things like APIs. So if you install Hanami pre-release today, you're gonna have 3 gems installed. The first one is Hanami, then there's utils and CLI. These are like the very basic gems that like create the core of the entire system. You can generate a skeleton. So if you create like a block skeleton with the CLI command, you're gonna have a basic structure for your application. One thing we decided to do recently is a simplified application skeleton, application architecture, I should say, which is like a Rails-like organization of code where you have a single top-level app, and basically that's it. So app directory is kind of like in Rails. The only default subdirectory that is there is the actions directory, which is supposed to include classes for handling endpoints. And basically this is your own directory where you will just implement your application. Then there is configuration directory with app, which has your application class, Puma obviously for the web server, routes with routes, settings with settings. Lib is just like in Rails, a place for library-like code that you can like share across the entire app. And spec is of course for your tests. We use RSpec by default, but you can use any other testing framework like Minitest or whatever else you have. But the gem right now that generates a skeleton defaults to RSpec. So Hanami components actually are defined in the gem file. They are added to the gem file as dependencies. So the main Hanami gem doesn't have runtime in the gem spec when it comes to the router and the controller. The reason for this is simple. This goes back to what I already said, that Hanami is an application framework. It's not specifically a web application framework. So this means that if you generate the app, it's going to have a gem file with Hanami router and controller added to the gem file, so that you have actually rack-based application stack available. Now, if you wanted to look at like a top-level architecture of the default stack, this is how it looks like. You have Hanami gem providing app, settings, router, action, and command line interface. And some of those are just libraries provided by dependencies of Hanami. The app is the main abstraction for your application. And if you follow the architecture that Hanami really suggests you to follow, and then the entire application, like literally everything that your application does, is encapsulated in this single place. This is really nice because this way you achieve a really nice isolation, and there is like no leaking state, or there is nothing that would depend on some external global state, which often happens in like typical Ruby applications. The application by default provides you with settings, which I will show you in a minute. Then the router is provided by the Hanami router gem. And of course, this is just a way of defining routes for rack. Then Hanami controller is a bit tricky when it comes to the naming, because the gem is called Hanami controller, but it provides like the main purpose of it is to provide you with action abstraction, which is a way for you to easily define classes that will handle endpoints. And CLI is, of course, command line interface. So this provides things like generators and common commands just for, working with your app. Things like, running migrations, all this stuff, this will be handled by the Hanami CLI gem. So I'm going to go through each of those and show you how it looks like and how it works. I mentioned that we follow convention over configuration. However, we moved it like a bit like further with something that we call zero config. So previously, Hanami would generate a class with some config. These would follow certain conventions, of course, but you would still like see configuration generated. Here, it's literally empty. Everything is configured for you behind the scenes. And of course, you can tweak pretty much everything if you have a need. However, by default, the application class is just empty, and you can pretty much use your app right away without defining anything or reading anything. It just works out of the box. Settings is a pretty big thing in Hanami because this is the first class concept that ships with some advanced features that make defining settings for your application a bit more convenient and also just more safe and more secure. If you use a gem called try configurable, you'll probably recognize this because under the hood, this is what's used. So settings is essentially your application settings. Currently, there is a backend for creating settings from env variables. It uses .env gem under the hood. What it allows you to do is that you can define settings explicitly with additional features like defining constructors with types that should be applied to the values or things like default values. This is really, really handy because, for example, if you define something as types params integer, then a string that is created from env will be coerced into an integer. And of course, it works with other types like booleans. So this is very handy. You can actually be very strict about these types. You can define things like types that, for example, a type that is a string, but it must be filled, it cannot be empty, or even match certain regex or any other criteria. It's literally anything you need. So that is very handy because the app will actually crash if your settings are not valid. So you can be sure that your system won't be running when it's misconfigured, which of course may happen if there is no validation for settings. There are, of course, gems that provide similar functionality for Rails and other frameworks. There's one gem that is called, I think, just config, which does exactly this. In Hanami, it's just by default, it's built into the framework. It's one of its core features. Now, something that I'm personally very excited about is the fact that we have very fast boot time. Hanami starts extremely fast. I mean, extremely, very fast, which is below 1 second on a decent machine. I mean, I'm not saying that it will like it will always boot below 1 second. So like, don't like check it on very slow machines and be like, oh, it's not below 1 second, because of course it may be below 1 second, but on a decent machine, it should be below 1 second. And that's just really nice. It makes development experience much better. It's fast regardless of the size of your application. And the reason for this is quite simple. The Hanami application, when it starts, it loads the minimum amount of code that it needs just to start the console or any other process. So even if you have hundreds of gems in your gem file, and even if you have lots of your own files, the app will still start very fast because everything is lazy loaded, unless you don't want it to be lazy loaded, which you can configure. But by default, everything is lazy loaded. So the console or any other thing that you start will start very fast. And of course, as a nice side effect of this, things like running tests is very fast. This is an example of, it's just like a dummy application that I created just for the sake of example and just playing with things. But this is a test that actually depends on the database. It creates some data in the database, it loads SQL, it loads its dependencies, and probably lots of other things. And it still loads in less than half a second, and the entire thing takes around half a second. So that's pretty cool. Like if you ever worked on a bigger Ruby project, probably a Rails project, then you probably experienced slow boot time and just things taking a lot of time to just start. This is, of course, especially problematic when it comes to running tests, because you're just staring at your screen and waiting. There are some solutions for this, like Spring or any other tool that preloads some processes and then they need to be restarted when files change and stuff like that. So it's kind of a workaround, and people typically have issues with such solutions. So we decided to take a different approach and focus really on like proper isolation and being able to load as little as possible in any given context. So when it comes to command line interface, we have common features like generating, like I showed you before, generating application skeleton, but also generating actions. And action is kind of like a method in a Rails controller. You can think about it like that. So if we generate posts.create, we're going to end up with a route added to your router, and then a corresponding class will be generated as well. The controller concept in Hanami is actually just the namespace. So in this case, you could say that there is a posts controller which includes various actions, and one of the actions is called create. Now, one of the nice things about actions in Hanami is that they are just objects. They are just Ruby objects that you can instantiate and call. The interface that they implement is compatible with Rack, obviously. So they behave pretty much like procs. The handle method is for you to implement. This is like your logic. Basically, your logic goes here. And it's, of course, like a trivial example of post creation without any validation whatsoever. But yeah, you can actually go to your console and ask for an action. The console comes with various convenient shortcuts. So for example, app is an instance of your application. So this is just a convenient way of interacting with your application. Then you can ask for any action that you defined. So we have posts.create. So under actions, we have posts and create action. Then the interface is, like you mentioned, it's just like a proc. So you can pass some data to the call method and you get a response. So you can probably imagine that this is very easy to test, because in a test for an action, you just do this, you just call it and you check the response. Now, the Hanami 2.0 release will include like the core functionality for building web applications, but it's gonna, apart from like not having a view layer when it comes to like generating HTML and stuff like that, It's not going to have any kind of a model, as people typically call it, component layer. There are, of course, existing libraries for working with databases, Active Record, SQL, ROMRB, and all this stuff. So you can use pretty much anything you want, anything you prefer. We could provide like a built-in support for these libraries, but it's just extra work, and we really need to finish what we already have and release it. So we decided to postpone any like official work on any additional integrations, because we can simply share some examples online, like on GitHub, and that should be enough for people to get started. So here is an example how you could integrate your Hanami application with SQL and actually mimic a typical setup that you can find in applications based on Rails. So you would have a models directory with model classes in like a global namespace, so they wouldn't be namespaced at all. And then you define a provider, which is a concept in Hanami that is responsible for loading and managing any kind of external dependency, external component that you want to expose to your application. This is basically a way of encapsulating integrations. So in case of SQL, we simply require it. And when you start this component, this models component, we connect to the database and we expose the database inside our application. So it's going to be accessible from within the application, and you will be able to like inject it in other places. Now you can like play with this in the console. So for example, you start a console and you want to get access to your models. So you just say start models. Start is one of the shortcuts of the console context, also for convenience, just like the app shortcut. And once you started your models, you have access to your database, and you can refer to model constants, and they will be automatically required and loaded as constants. This is based on Zeitwerk that you probably know, which is a constant and file loader used in Rails. I think it's now the default one, starting with Rails 7, if I remember correctly. So this is really nice because pretty much anything can be integrated with Hanami like that, and you get a lot of control over what happens and how it happens and when it happens. Which means that, for example, in case of tests, you could have like a test helper that, for example, starts a specific component like a database, or I don't know, some pub subsystem or some worker or whatever, only when it's needed. And this is the isolation that I mentioned before, that you can actually isolate a little piece of your application, in this case as a provider. So yeah, that's pretty useful. Now, the $1 million question, as I call it, is how do I organize my app so that it's maintainable in the longer term? This is actually something that we want to tackle with Hanami. And of course, there is no single answer, but we have some solutions. The default architecture that is provided when you like generate a new application with Hanami, and this is how it's going to work with Hanami 2.0 by default, and probably in the future versions as well. It's a simplified architecture. However, this is not like the end of your architecture. Like you can evolve your architecture when the need arises. So one concept that we introduced in Hanami is called slices. And this is kind of like Rails engines. Basically, even if you have a single application, so the default setup that we have with a single application, your application is actually a slice. It's just one slice, and that's it. However, you can always create more slices, which means that you can have an application that grows and becomes very big, or not even very big. It just grows significantly enough that you decide to split it into smaller chunks, and these chunks are called slices in Hanami. This diagram actually shows one of the applications that I built last year. This is a simple backend for synchronizing files across repositories on GitHub. It's got a single API endpoint actually that GitHub sends events to, and then it's got a bigger component, a bigger slice called worker, which is background processing, which is the most complex part of the entire application. And both API and worker slices need certain things from the core slice. And when you look at the directory structure, you actually can easily notice that these slices are really different, which is actually a really good example of how things can evolve and how things can be split, because they are just different, and then they can be like treated differently and handled differently. So in the slices directory, I have API, core, and worker. These are three slices. In the config, I have only API and worker, and this is an example of convention over configuration, because the core is a slice as well, but it's not explicitly defined as a class, because Hanami will look at all these subdirectories and see that there is a core subdirectory, but there is no core class that you define, so it just defines it for you. So it's really a good example of what convention over configuration can do for you. And it's of course very implicit, and you like have to learn about it, but then again, you don't have to define boilerplate code, so this is nice. Now, when we go through like individual repositories, we'll see that the core provides repositories. The repositories are like a gateway to a database. Now, with API and worker slices depend on certain repositories. Now, API only has actions because this is the web front end of the entire application. So it only implements actions, which are endpoint handlers. Now, the worker clearly is the most complex one, because it's got its own config, it's got certain providers, it's got commands, queries, and jobs. So clearly, this is like the biggest part of the entire application. Now, when you take a look at worker slice, you will see that it defines which core components it needs from the core slice. So it requires 3 repositories, and this is the only repositories that it needs. So it only imports the 3 that it needs, and that's it. And this is really cool, because you can have a system that can easily share certain dependencies across all the components, so that like the boundaries are clear. Like there is no such thing as like global access to everything, and it's difficult to say where, like, first of all, it's difficult to see the boundaries, but it's also difficult to understand what the dependencies actually are. Like it's hard to see the coupling between your components. Here we can be very explicit. We can say like this thing requires those components. and that's it. Now, with such a setup, we can have really nice benefits. Just like in case of fast booting, when you start the console, or running tests that start very, very fast, you can also leverage this architecture in such a way that you can define, for example, a background process that you will start, that you will like run on production on your servers, that only needs the worker part. So this is just like a single piece of your application, a single slice that will be loaded into memory and started. And the process itself will simply be smaller because of this. So this is a clear benefit. Like, not only it starts like faster, but it actually consumes less memory. So this was like one of the goals of this entire system. It was kind of tricky to achieve it, but we've made it. So I'm extremely happy to see this working, because it's just so nice. Now, just like in case of running tests in general, when it comes to like running tests for a single test from a single slice, you get the same benefit. Like here, I ran a spec from the worker slice, and this one, it needs a lot of stuff. Like it needs some authorization modules, it needs database access, it needs some like additional libraries for parsing certain JSON data structs and stuff like that. So it's quite a lot. And still, I was close to 1 second, but still below 1 second. So that's pretty cool. And remember that this is without things like Spring, no process preloaders. This isn't even using Bootsnap. I actually realized after I prepared these slides that I could actually install Bootsnap just to get requires working faster. So I'm not sure what the impact would be, but it would probably be significant. So a similar story, like if you have an application that is split into smaller pieces, you get benefits like that. You can run a small portion of your application. You end up with less memory being used. You can run tests faster, and it's just really cool because it's smaller, it's easier to understand. You can work on it in isolation. Like you can even go with solutions like configure editor just to focus on a single part of your app. And even though it's still the same repository, you are like working on the same on a single slice instead of the entire app. So yeah, overall, you could say that there is a clear path when it comes to like the evolution of your application. And honestly, this is like one of the hardest things in our job, to build application that will grow in such a way that you can maintain your productivity, essentially. It's relatively easy to start something and work on something for, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months, a year and a half maybe. But at some point, things will get messy, and it's just good to know what to do when things get messy. I, of course, just scratched the surface here, because honestly, there are many related topics. Like, for example, ROMRB would play a major role here because it also has like a path that you can follow when it comes to a growing system that is becoming more and more complex. So yeah, it's going to be a big part of this general path. But even without ROM, just the architecture of Hanami itself provides you with the tools that you need to really nicely split your application into smaller pieces, and maybe even extract certain pieces into standalone systems eventually, and like create more like a service-oriented architecture. So yeah, you can just sleep better thanks to this. And yeah, that's Hanami 2. I probably went too fast, so we're going to have more time for questions. But yeah, thanks for listening, and Honestly, ask me anything. I think we have like 35 minutes or so. Thank you.
So now we have one raised hand. Give me a sec. Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Anko.
Hi, Piotr. So I wanted to ask regarding. So what I really like from Hanami settings is this automatic configuration with .env, where it automatically figures out which keys to load depending on the setting keys. And I was wondering, so I was playing locally with Roda app, and I was trying to set it up like similarly to how like the Hanami 2 starter app is set up, because it was really great guide to follow the conventions of Hanami. And I was wondering if the .env integration, if you've maybe planned to move it into dry configurable, if there was any talk about like kind of moving it into dry RB so that it's also kind of usable outside of Hanami.
Not really, no, at least not yet. But you know, we are definitely interested in, you know, making reusable software in general. So whenever it makes sense to extract something to be completely standalone, and there's like interest, then yeah, would be definitely interested in doing that. The settings class is I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure that it's not really tied to Hanami in any way. It's quite standalone. The backend that loads the env variables is also kind of like detached and just reused within the class. So it would be rather simple to extract it. When it comes to like dry configurable, I'm not sure if it would fit there. Maybe it's definitely something to discuss. We are working on releasing dry configurable 1.0 before Hanami 2.0. So I guess it's going to be a good moment to think about this kind of stuff after everything is released, because it's right now it's a bit too early. But yeah, eventually, yeah, we could consider this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we have a few questions in the chat. Maybe we should look up to them.
Yeah, so Gabrielle asks, can we chain actions? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's a good idea, but you could do that. Like I mentioned, they are just objects, so you would just call them explicitly within one action. You would just call other actions, and you could even come up with some DSL for like declaring chainable actions, but I'm not sure if it's a good idea, to be honest. Like if there's like more processing needed, then you would probably benefit from like a custom object that you would call in an action. Yeah, and if it has to be used in many places and be like parameterized, you could still do that. So, but yeah, you can chain actions because they are just objects, so we can chain them. Oh yeah, then yeah, so another question, do you plan to do something similar to Hotwire Live for Hanami? Yes. Oh my god, yes. I've had like a to-do for like over a year now, which essentially says look into Hotwire live view and see how this could be done for Hanami. And I know that there are people who are interested in helping with that, so we will get there. I'm learning. I mean, I haven't started, but like I'm learning Phoenix in general, and we use live view at work, so I will have sooner or later I will have an opportunity to work on a live view related functionality, so I will get some experience with it, and this should help me figure out how this could be done in Hanami. But yeah, we want to have that definitely.
Okay, we have one raised hand. Yeah, hello.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks a lot. Guys, first of all, thank you for everything you do. Just a great job. And my question is about so useful things like E18.9 and translations, because it's potentially simple task, commonly used, but I have a lot of pain with integration with Hanami 1.0. So first of all, translation of database field locally from file, and of course route translation, how it looks like in Hanami 2.0. Thanks.
Yeah, there is nothing built for I18N yet. And when it comes to database stuff, every integration for every library will probably just work with it, because I'm actually not sure how it's implemented in Active Record and SQL outside of Rails. I'm not sure like how much is provided by Rails itself. So we would have to investigate this. But yeah, I'm actually glad that you mentioned this, because yeah, it's a tricky thing to have, and we probably need to add something like special here. But yeah, for now, like we don't really have anything. But if you have experience, like you mentioned with Hanami 1, it would be great to know like what kind of challenges you had, and we could then look into making it much better in 2.0. But that's definitely going to happen after 2.0 and more closely to like 2.1, when we are working on like the view integration and stuff like that, because it's related.
Eventually I can help.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah.
Okay.
I suspect that the database stuff will be simpler than the view stuff, because I would assume that the like SQL and Active Record will just work with
Yeah,
I18N.
exactly.
Yeah. So it's just a matter of like wiring things together and coming up with a provider like I showed you in the slides. So yeah.
Exactly. Okay, I will write to you.
Cool.
afterward.
Yeah. Thanks.
Very welcome.
Right, so we have a question in the chat. Would it be possible to use it together with dry monads and dry transactions? Yes, sure, of course. You can use whatever you want. So there are no like restrictions or there is, I mean, not yet. Maybe we'll introduce some kind of a service layer, but for now there's nothing, and you can just use whatever you prefer. I started playing with a library, it kind of like dry transactions, like last week. Started building a prototype, so I may push it somewhere. But yeah, it's a library that is based on similar concepts like transaction, and has a more like an agnostic approach to handling results and chaining things together, so that it's basically it's based on interfaces that anything could implement. So I may have some solution for that in the future. Yeah, we're like still discussing what to do with trade transactions, by the way. Like we recently realized that transactions is probably not a good name for the gem because it's not really transaction. It's more like chaining arbitrary operations with error handling or result handling in general. But yeah, you can use whatever you want. So try monads, transactions, or any other gem that implements similar functionality. Like in case of actions, you just define your own logic inside a handle method. You can delegate the heavy work to some external library. Like in case of right transaction, it would be a transaction operation. So yeah, definitely possible.
Okay. Yeah, another question. Even two.
Any specific plans for adoption? And do you plan to do consistent cadence releases? Plans for adoption. Is it a question like, I'm not sure if I understand this question, to be honest. Could you clarify? Sorry for the noise. Ugh. But yeah, I can, in the meantime, I can more about making it easier for more people to join. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So one of the big things is of course documentation. We've been, really focused for the last few months to just deliver, and we're like wrapping things up as we speak, like I mentioned. So that's great. But once 2.0 is released, we are going to invest more time into just creating an environment where more people will be able to contribute, because that's just absolutely essential. It was much more tricky to do the same thing, and I don't even think this would be like feasible when it comes to like working on the core part. Like honestly, 90% of the work has been done by Tim. It's just a very specific chunk of work that had to be done, and after 2.0 is released, it's going to be much simpler to just welcome more contributors, just because the scope of work for 2.1 will be bigger. We will need help with projects like assets, helpers, all the front-end stuff in general, and there are, lots of additional things like integrations with other gems. I suspect that for integration with Active Record, I actually spent some time yesterday trying to make Active Record work, and I made it work pretty easily until I hit a wall that is called migrations. It was really difficult to get migrations working. I mean, I spent like maybe 2 hours on it, but still it felt like it's a bit too hard, and it probably needs a bit more work. I mean, a bit more like custom code. So we will need help with this kind of stuff. So yeah, there will be like API docs, guides, and like way more tasks to tackle for way more people. So when it comes to adoption itself, yeah, the docs and the guides are essential. They are a work in progress. We're going to have version 2 of guides, like a draft version available soon. And yeah, all kinds of tutorials, articles, and any kind of resources that can help will be also very welcome. Whoa, okay, let me catch up with the chat. Right, so is there any documentation available for V2? There will be. It's being written and we're going to publish it like a draft that will be finalized for the 2.0 release. I think next week. And yeah, there will be regular releases. I mean, we won't probably have like a strict schedule because it's open source and we work in our free time. So yeah, but definitely it's going to be, actively maintained. It's, it's used on production already by core team members. So, we're like in the zone here. Great job. Thank you. What can I use for admin panel as active admin gem in Rails? There's nothing yet. It's a bit tricky because we don't have like a default persistence layer. So I assume that if we had an integration with Active Record, then you could probably mount active admin as a rack endpoint. I think it should just work. In which abstraction to implement gRPC by Hanami convention? We don't have conventions for this yet. I mean, honestly, up to you. So cannot answer that. Given that Hanami 2.0 uses Tidework to register classes, is it theoretically possible to reference them directly without using the dry container syntax? Yes. So I mentioned during the talk that Hanami comes with an architecture, but it's not like imposed on you. It's a very strong suggestion to follow certain guidelines. It's all going to be documented. But honestly, you can do whatever you want. So we support arbitrary directory structures, honestly. Like you can organize your app just like in Rails. You can organize your app as a gem-like structure with directories matching class namespace organization. You can have like collapsed directories where certain namespaces are just like inferred from configuration, but they are not present as directories. So you can do whatever you want. And when it comes to constants, the consequence of using Tidework is, of course, that if you refer to a constant that is not defined, it's going to trigger the loading process. And if you have things configured as expected, then the constant will show up automatically. It's just that this is not, in majority of the cases, I should say, it's not something that will be recommended as the way of doing things in Hanami. You are absolutely encouraged to leverage the depths module with auto injection and use objects, have them registered in the container, and yeah, all this stuff. So, but yeah, you will be able to take shortcuts with Tidework for sure.